So I know I told you guys today we were going to do cardiovascular system next. I changed my mind. We're going to do hormones, primarily because this is going to help us to understand kind of the back end of metabolism as well. We've been talking about, right, metabolic pathways. We talked about what's been happening with metabolism during exercise. And the big take home from today, hopefully, is going to be how do we, during a bout of exercise, use the hormonal response that we're going to get to help us ideally maintain blood glucose levels. Okay, to maintain blood glucose levels. So we're going to start. We're just going to draw a line on the board. Okay. We have graph this. Okay. Blood glucose. This is what we want blood glucose to look like at all times. Okay, at all times. This staying flat is one of the body's absolutely like most vital homeostatic sort of things. Okay, we need to keep blood glucose constant. The brain runs on glucose. Okay, the brain runs on glucose. So if we get something where it's flat and then it begins to dip down like this, there's going to be a point in here when you might go into a coma. There's a point way out here where you might die. Okay. You eat a meal and it rises and it goes up like this for like an hour or two. That's not a big deal. Okay. Not a huge big deal. But if it stays that way chronically, it'll kill off your kidneys. It's bad for your liver, right? It's bad for all kinds of things. This is in essence what happens potentially in uncontrolled diabetes and those kinds of things. So at so many costs, and there's going to be these little fluctuations around all during the day, we want to try to keep blood glucose constant. Okay. And so that's one of the things that we're going to use the hormonal response during exercise to do. Okay. So, well, maybe this will go. No. Just thinking about going. There we go. Okay. So, learning objectives, what's hormones? Okay, I know most of you guys know what this is. We'll talk about the function of specific hormones during exercise. So I'll list you guys some, right? And then we'll talk about what they do. What physiological processes are controlled by hormones during exercise? There are many, but the big one we're going to hit on is blood glucose, the functions of these hormones and how they regulate blood glucose, and then do they change during exercise? Okay. So I will, as an illustrative purpose for you guys, because I'm an old person, say, when I first started doing this lecture back in the mid 2000s, right? When most of y'all were at least born by then, right? They were like, so 304 kind of birthday, somewhere in there. Yes. Okay. Good. There was a big deal especially in professional baseball about Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa. I don't know who this dude is, but apparently he was a bodybuilder that was clearly taking some steroids in the midst of all of this. And so when people think about exercise and hormones, you probably think of what? What do we think about? Steroids, right? You think of testosterone. And so HGH, growth hormone, which we will talk about both of those today. But you normally think about this, right? We think of hormones, we think of take steroids, get big muscles, hit bombs. That's the general way we would think about it, or do all of this and go up on stage and flex, I guess. I don't, again, all of that sort of makes my brain go a little bit sideways, but there we go. Okay. Now, as things progress, right, you guys may have heard some of this. If you are interested in these kinds of things, I got a couple of fascinating books that you can read, right? Would you think of what Lance Armstrong was doing and think of the hormonal response during exercise? You think of steroids with him, but he did take some. He took something else. What else he took? The single most powerful thing for aerobic exercise that you can take is EPO, erythropoietin. It's a hormone that makes more red blood cells. If all of you guys want to be better aerobic or endurance athletes, today we will give you an infusion of a pint of O negative blood, okay? And your VO2 max will go up 10% today. Okay, today, immediately, because you have more red blood cells. So when you take, okay, when you take EPO and you make more red blood cells, it helps you be more fit in those ways. All right. And then you do things like the Ironman, where this guy was doing stuff for 11 straight hours, right? The real original Ironman. I forget how far you swim. It's like you swim a 5K, and then you bike like 150 miles or something ridiculous, and then you run a marathon. It's just crazy, right? The limits of what the human body can do are astounding, but in the midst of all of this, were these guys taking steroids? Some of them probably doing things, but what I would also point out though is during these sort of Tour de France, these kind of endurance events, like both of this, we have to have, during the bout, we have to have a certain hormonal response to help us regulate blood glucose, to regulate fat metabolism, to regulate cardiovascular function and these kinds of things. And if that gets off, then you can't do this. So there's ways to cheat it to make it better, but also especially during endurance events, having the right response is really, really, really important. Okay. Okay. So during long duration exercise, we will start talking about these on Wednesday. There's a host of cardiovascular changes, right? Heart rate goes up, stroke volume goes up, cardiac output goes up, breathing goes up, rate and depth is going to increase. We already talked about what happens to metabolism. Temperature goes up, your core body temperature goes up. If you don't sweat, if you don't use the cardiovascular system to move warm blood towards your skin to get rid of heat, you'll cook yourself inside of an hour. Okay, so we have hormones that are going to control this, and then fluid balance. Okay, as we sweat to do all of this, we're losing water. We're going to pull water from other places. What all this is going on there. Okay, so all of these things have to change in concert to allow for proper function, to allow for you to exercise for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours or 11 or whatever the hell it is. Okay. Most of these things, the changes that we see in most of these things are at least initially, if not for the longer term, driven by a lot of changes, hormone concentrations during exercise. Hormones are a way for us to communicate from the brain to certain tissues, or from one tissue to another tissue. Okay. In the way that the brain communicates to muscles using electricity, we can use hormones to tell this tissue to do this, this other tissue to do that. Okay. Okay. So if we look at all of these things, we'll start off by talking about substrate utilization during exercise. As I said, regulating blood glucose, keeping blood glucose constant during a bout of exercise is absolutely key to your ability to maintain exercise. Okay. Who has had breakfast this morning? Okay. Who hasn't had breakfast? Okay. Those of you guys that haven't had breakfast have more hormones circulating around than those of you that did, and different ones. Those of you that did have breakfast probably have more insulin than everybody else that did not have breakfast, okay? Because we are using the hormones in response to a meal or a non-meal to regulate blood glucose levels. And one of the ways we regulate blood glucose is also by regulating blood levels of free fatty acid. Okay? If we're using glucose, we need to replace that glucose in the blood. But one of the ways in metabolism to not use the glucose and to keep it constant is to instead use free fatty acids. Okay. So you guys will see with our hormonal response that we're going to do things to sort of spare glucose, break down glycogen, but also break down adipose tissue to get those things. Okay. So let's talk about all of this. Okay? energy demand increases during exercise. So our substrate that we're gonna use in metabolism must also increase. Okay? You're starting to use carbohydrate, you're starting to use some fat in aerobic metabolism. Maybe you're using carbohydrate in glycolysis. So when energy demand goes up, we must increase substrate availability and substrate moving from the blood into muscles so that we can put those through those metabolic pathways. Okay? So what we do then is we mobilize and we release fat and glucose from their storage sites. So our hormone response is going to help us break down glycogen in the liver, break down glycogen in the muscle, and break down fat, especially in adipose tissue, and put it into the bloodstream. Okay? So remember those things. What are our storage molecules? Glycogen, adipose tissue. Okay? Glucose is stored in the liver, muscle is glycogen, and we have a little bit of fat storage inside of your muscle, but it's mostly adipose. And then the question is, where do these mobilize? So when we break the substrates down, we call them mobilized. Where do they go? Glycogen in the liver goes into the blood. Free fatty acids that appear out of your adipose tissue go into the blood. Muscle glycogen, when it gets broken down, goes directly, it stays, the glucose stays right there in the muscle. Okay? That's what we're going to try to do. So we're going to dump glucose into the bloodstream from liver glycogen. We're going to dump free fatty acids. If we can't do those two things, we're not going to be able to exercise for very long. Okay? So I already mentioned this a little bit, but we'll try to do it. We'll try to walk through it again. Okay? It's so important. Why must plasma glucose be controlled? Okay. Well, your brain needs a constant supply of glucose. Okay? Because it runs on glucose. Glucose falls too much, brain gets very catastrophizing about it. And it says, pass out, go into a coma, shut everything down. We want to save whatever glucose we have just for the brain. Okay. So the problem is that when you start exercising, is your demand and your ability to pull glucose out of the blood into working muscles is going to increase. And so if we don't replenish the blood glucose in some ways, it can fall because we're exercising and the brain can become unhappy. Okay? So if the brain becomes unhappy, you're not going to keep exercising. It's going to cause initially central fatigue, then it will cause health. Okay? And so that's kind of what we're trying to preserve and why all of this is going to be important. So the way that we try to maintain blood glucose, it's kind of like lactate. Okay, we maintain blood glucose by doing a combination of two things. Okay, we can put more glucose into the blood to match what is going into our muscles. Okay, that would help us keep it constant. Or an alternative way to do things would be to take less out. Okay, if I take less glucose out of the blood, then there's less of it to put more in. So I put more glucose in by breaking down glycogen in the liver to replace it. And I remove less by using fat as an energy substrate. Okay? By using fat as an energy substrate. That's going to help us out. So that's the balance that we're trying to strike. Okay? So as you exercise, we'll release hormones. Those hormones will attempt to drive and put more glucose into the blood, put more fat into the blood, and the combination is we'll keep replenishing the glucose, and hopefully by having more fat, we'll use the fat, therefore we won't use the glucose. Does that make sense, guys? Y'all understand that as a concept? Okay. Okay. So I want to introduce basically one other concept and idea here, okay, that you guys may encounter. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about all of the different ins and outs of it and those kinds of things, but you're gonna see it in the popular press. You're gonna see it if you look at anything about people drinking Gatorade or Powerade or taking gels and those kinds of things. Okay, so I will try to draw this. You have a muscle, okay? And here we have a blood vessel, and we've got glucose. Oh God, that's a bad looking liver. And that's a slightly better. Right? You've got glycogen in your liver that's dumping glucose into the bloodstream. And then the muscle is taking in that glucose. Okay. Also, though, in the muscle, we have glycogen in our muscle as well. And so one of the responses to exercise, as we have already talked about, is break this glycogen down and get glucose from here. So I don't have to use glucose from the bloodstream. Therefore, I don't have to break down liver glycogen. So that's a good idea, but there's a problem. If low blood glucose makes the brain unhappy, equally low muscle glycogen also makes the brain unhappy. Okay, and so we call sort of the depletion of glycogen there in the muscle, which takes, I don't know, 90 minutes to 2 hours during a kind of moderate to high intensity exercise. When that happens, you feel like shit and you want to stop. So one of the other things that our hormonal response will help us do is the idea of what is called sparing of muscle glycogen. We want to use free fatty acids and use glucose that's come from liver glycogen, because we have way more liver glycogen than we do muscle glycogen. We want to use those to help us get energy in the muscle so that we don't have to break down or use up all of that glycogen in our muscles for as long as possible. Okay, so we call that as a concept sparing. We're going to spare our muscle glycogen. And it's this concept and this idea, okay, is the only instance when drinking Gatorade or Powerade or taking a gel is of any additional benefit to you beyond drinking water or beer or Dr. Pepper, whatever else it is that you want. Okay. So it's only in these situations where you think you might run out of muscle glycogen. And you drink Gatorade, and the Gatorade raises blood glucose levels. So you've got more blood glucose, which can come in, so you don't have to use up your muscle glycogen. Okay. So that's a concept. We'll come back to that at the very, very end, but that's the main sort of big deal. Okay. Okay. So remember, our goals during exercise is to match glucose uptake by the muscle to release from glycogen in the liver. And we conversely also would love to do something so we don't use up all of our muscle glycogen. Primarily, that's going to be coming from using more fat. So we're going to do two things. Okay. We need to sense how much glucose is going in. We need to be able to then break down, use hormones to drive the breakdown of liver glycogen, and use hormones to break down adipose tissue fat so that we can use the fat and spare the glycogen. So we're doing two things, right? Maintaining blood glucose and then starting to use more fat so we can spare glycogen. All of this allows us to prevent fatigue. Okay. I don't want to get on too much of a tangent or talk about evolution and a whole bunch of these sorts of things, but we are in the animal world one of the single best endurance sort of athletes, if you will, because of our ability to thermoregulate. Okay. And so there's a school of thought that people like ancient humans would chase a deer around all day. And They would chase and chase and chase and chase, and eventually the deer overheats and it collapses. And then we got it. Okay? Because we are really, really good from a thermoregulatory standpoint. From a body surface area, because we're bipedal, we don't have fur, right? Anybody that has a dog and has a dog in the Oklahoma summer understands they got to pant, they got to drink a bunch of water, because we don't have as much body. We're very, very good at this. And we're also really good at this, at allowing ourselves to maintain blood glucose, at allowing ourselves to spare muscle glycogen. So if we need to chase that deer for hours, we can do it. Okay? We can do it. And so that's why some of this is set up the way that it is. The converse side of that is we're also really good at replenishing these things afterwards. And that's why now that we have Chick-fil-A and all you can eat pizza and those sorts of things, that and we don't really run around all day, that we have an obesity problem, because that's sort of the way that our genes and metabolic machinery is coded. If we're not exercising a bunch, we end up with problems. Okay. Okay, so before we talk about what each hormone does, let's do a little brief overview. You guys remember what a hormone is? A hormone is a messenger, chemical messenger, and it is a hormone because it goes in the blood. I will call, in our instances here, epinephrine and norepinephrine as hormones because they go into the blood. Epinephrine and norepinephrine can also serve as what's called a neurotransmitter, but in those instances, they don't ever make it into the blood. It just goes from one nerve ending onto another, or from one nerve ending onto a particular tissue, and it's still the same epi and norepi. It's just kind of what we call it changes based upon where it travels. Okay, so hormones go in the blood. Organs that make hormones are called endocrine organs. Okay, we also have non-endocrine organs such as nerves, and there's some debate on if stuff comes out of the nerve, should it be a neurotransmitter or not, even if that nerve puts it into the blood. We're not going to fuss over this too much. Okay, hormones are messengers, they travel in the blood, they come from endocrine organs. Hormones work in one of a couple of different ways. Okay, depending upon the structure of the hormone, hormones bind to receptors. Those receptors can either be on the surface of a cell, or they can be on the inside of the cell, or they can be in the nucleus of the cell. Okay, and so once they bind on those, they tend to promote or initiate different actions in that cell. They tell the cell to make something or stop making something else, okay, or to activate this process or to shut this other process off. Okay. Generally, though, it works like this: that you've got entry into the cell, it either binds to a receptor on the surface, then it goes in, or it comes into the cell and it binds. Okay, we're going to tell it to make or shut off protein and enzyme synthesis. We do activate these things that are called second messengers, which is this cascade of signals, ping, 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 kind of downstream to the accepting. Right? That's how hormones work. I know most of that is going to be review for you guys. We have what we call steroid hormones, which come from cholesterol. Steroid hormones are lipid soluble because their base sort of structure is fat. Steroid hormones can easily go into cells. They bind on nuclear receptors. Okay, they come in and they bind in the nucleus. Testosterone, okay, estrogen are steroid hormones. The interesting thing about steroid hormones is they often have to have a carrier molecule in the blood. Because they are a fat-based molecule, they don't mix well with water, and your blood is mostly water. We have non-steroidal hormones, which most of the time are what we call peptides. So they're a protein hormone. They're not lipid soluble. So they float in the blood very easy, but they tend to bind to receptors on the cell membrane. Okay, onto the cell membrane. So here's some rough actions of steroid hormones. You can see them out in the blood, right? And they're going to get moved into the nucleus, bind on a receptor there. And in this instance, it's driving protein synthesis. Could be anything else. Okay. Here's a peptide hormone, something like insulin. right, when the hormone is in the blood, it binds to a receptor on the cell surface, it activates, and all of this stuff down through here, this is called a second messenger system. You guys don't have to memorize any of this, we're not gonna talk about the different kinds of G proteins, or what the heck adenylate cyclase is, or how any of this stuff works, just that it binds on the surface, second messenger activation, and then that is what's gonna come down here. And in this instance, it's initiating enzyme activity, and that drives our cellular response, but it could be any number. But it could be any number of things. Here's a list of things that we're gonna talk about as endocrine organs. So an area of the brain, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary. Okay, those are gonna be big, big endocrine organs. Your thyroids, which are right here, okay, in your throat. The adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex, which are gonna be on top of your kidneys. We'll talk a little bit more in the next couple of slides about the pancreas, okay? Kidneys themselves are gonna make some things that help us control body water as well as erythropoietin. And then we call them collectively, right, gonads, which could be the testes or the ovaries, which are gonna make some steroid hormones. There's lots of other tissues, guys. There's lots of other tissues that are gonna make hormones. We just don't really have time in the midst of all of this to cover everything. Okay. All right. So let's go through and talk about a few individual hormones and what might happen during exercise. And we're going to start with, okay, one of the ones that we understand the best. One of the ones that you guys should likely be very familiar with. Okay. So our endocrine organ for insulin is the beta cells in the pancreas. Insulin is a peptide hormone, and insulin gets released as blood glucose levels rise. So if we're getting here and blood glucose begins to go up, as soon as that happens, that triggers insulin release. Okay. The pancreas is monitoring blood glucose. It goes up, it releases insulin. Insulin goes into the blood. It floats by what we call an insulin sensitive tissue, primarily skeletal muscle. It binds to its receptor, as you can see here. Okay. And then it tells those cells to move glucose receptors out to the surface of those cells. So in skeletal muscle, those glucose receptors are called GLUT4. And I do want you guys to know this because it's really, really important. It's called GLUT4. Okay. So you ate a cinnamon roll for breakfast, you digest it, or you eat it, and about 30 to 45 minutes later, blood glucose begins to rise. You release insulin. That insulin stimulates skeletal muscle to translocate or move these GLUT4 receptors from their vesicles inside of the muscle cell, stick them onto the surface. Glucose then flows by. It binds to GLUT4, and then it pulls it into the cell, which lowers your blood glucose back down and signals to the pancreas to stop making insulin. Okay. That's how all of this works. Okay. Insulin also promotes the synthesis of glycogen. So by driving more glucose in, we're going to try to store it up in the muscle if we possibly can. If that doesn't work and you've already are sort of full there, then it ends up back in the blood, and insulin drives the promotion of adipose tissue. It's a whole separate thing for a different day. Okay. That's how insulin works. Here's a fun thing that you guys should already know. Everybody stand up. Stand up. Okay. Anybody have a family member or a friend or someone who's diabetic? Of course you do. It's Oklahoma, right? This is how we are. I'm from Arkansas, I know. We're all in the same boat, okay? If they're a type 2 diabetic, I'm going to show you what we can do to essentially cure their diabetes. Okay? Squat. Back up. Squat. Back up. One more. Squat. Back up. Okay? We've cured your diabetes. Okay, sit. Doing just that. Okay, just that. We have initiated by doing muscle contractions something called the insulin-like effect of exercise. Okay, the insulin-like effect of exercise. Insulin lowers blood glucose levels. So does muscle contractions. When you contract a skeletal muscle, you don't have to have insulin. But you contract skeletal muscle, it also signals for GLUT4 to go to the membrane and bring glucose. Why might that be a good thing? Why would you want to have contractions initiate bringing more glucose in out of the blood? I can preserve muscle glycogen. Good, Victor. There's an even more basic thing than that, though. How much glucose do you have in your muscle just floating around? Not as glycogen, just glucose. Not a lot. You did 3 squats, right? We are stimulating aerobic metabolism. We need some substrate, right? We need some glucose. So one of the other big things is that, yes, this helps us prevent breakdown of muscle glycogen, but it also it brings energy substrate in as soon as we begin to sense that we're contracting muscles and metabolism has increased, right? Your 3 squats, we probably primarily got most stuff from creatine phosphate and that, but if we went for much longer, we're gonna have substrate. So muscle contractions induce an insulin-like effect of exercise. So if you're a type 2 diabetic and you make plenty of insulin, but your tissues don't respond to it, so it doesn't drive blood glucose down, all you got to do is just walk and it will lower your blood glucose levels. The other thing is if you walk and you do contractions, then it actually, you get more insulin receptors tomorrow and the day after. And so you work out today and you have better insulin sensitivity, it takes less insulin to get the same glucose in for the coming days and all of that. Okay, it's the single magic thing. A little bit of diet modification, stop eating Starbursts and those kinds of things, and regular exercise will go a really, really long ways towards both preventing and treating type 2 diabetes. It's because of this. We do not understand fully where in the second messenger pathway contractions act. We will figure it out, and a person will win a Nobel Prize for it, because we will have cured type 2 diabetes once we do. We will have a drug, we can target all of these things. There are drugs now that you can take, a thing called metformin. Outside of Viagra, it's the single most widely prescribed drug in the world. So Joey laughs, but you guys look, the most widely prescribed drugs are for erectile dysfunction, they're for low LDL cholesterol, so they're lipid lowering drugs, and then it's metformin, which is a thing that makes you more sensitive to insulin in all of those things. Okay, so that's what goes on here in the midst of all of this. Okay, somewhere in here, kind of like with what drives the sort of hypertrophy response, disruption on the membrane causes something to happen, and this goes. So that's going to help us bring stuff in, which is going to be good. Okay, but as that happens, we're going to start lowering blood glucose, and that's going to help us trigger the other hormone responses that occur in response to exercise. Okay, now I think you guys probably talked about glucagon in Principles of Health and Fitness, right? Dr. Pinku calls it a counter-regulatory hormone, which it is in those ways. We're not going to get into it in that much depth. We're going to talk about what happens during a bout of exercise. So glucagon, like insulin, comes from the pancreas, but it comes from the alpha cells. It's also a peptide hormone, but it is released when blood glucose falls. Okay, so in many ways, glucagon exhibits the opposite function of insulin. Glucose gets too low, pancreas releases glucagon, and it functions then to start to break down muscle and liver glycogen to try to raise blood glucose levels and to provide glucose inside the muscle for continued exercise. Okay. The big thing is this is one of the primary drivers, as I said, okay, of glycogen breakdown in the liver. Glucagon also promotes the breakdown of fat from adipose tissue. This takes a little bit longer than the glycogen breakdown. And it also promotes the process of gluconeogenesis. So if you have some proteins floating around in the liver, they will get converted into glucose. Okay. So as things fall, glucagon tries to drive us back up to baseline levels. Okay, to baseline levels to help us mobilize enough from liver glycogen to match what the muscle cells are taking out during metabolism. Okay. Oh, one of my other favorite ones. Tell you guys a story about thyroid hormone in a minute. Okay. So thyroid hormone is a fascinating hormone. Okay. It plays a really key role in sort of your resting metabolic rate. Okay. It also plays an interesting role in controlling your mood and your personality in the midst of this. Okay. So there are two flavors of thyroid hormone, something called triiodothyronine or T3, and then thyroxine, which is T4. Okay. We actually give our cat medication that tries to lower her thyroid hormone. I have to rub shit in her ear twice a day, and it blocks basically the production of thyroxine, which makes her really sluggish now. So because these things are going to control metabolic rate, so they come out here. They are regulatory hormones. Okay, the regulatory hormones. If I just inject every one of you guys with T3 and T4, your metabolic rate goes up. You also start to get real jittery. Okay, real jittery. If we gave you too much meth and you're having withdrawals or something. Okay. It's very important for weight control and feelings of energy and fatigue. It is what we call a permissive hormone. And so permissive is going to indicate that there's not a huge number of direct effects from this hormone, but it helps facilitate the function. It permits other hormones and other enzymes and things to reach and work in a way that is best. Okay. It really works well, especially with epinephrine. Okay. Especially with epinephrine. Very common in people and in animals to see both hyperthyroidism, where you have too much thyroid hormone, and hypothyroidism, where you make too little. Okay? Where you make too little. Okay? You don't have to have a show of hands, but in a class of 60 or so, there's a reasonable chance that one of y'all is potentially either hyper or hypo. Okay. In people that are y'all's age, we tend to see more people that are hypo than we do hyper. If you make too little and it can get diagnosed, you just take artificial T4, you take thyroxine, and it raises those levels. People that are hypo tend to have less energy. They tend to have unexplained weight gain and those kinds of things. And so we give you more, energy comes back, people tend to lose weight. Simultaneously, people that are hyperthyroid, real twitchy, real just kind of wiggly, right? They act like my daughter all the time. Can't sit still, just all that kind of stuff. So you can take medicine and lower those as well. Okay. But there are going to be things that go into this small. Okay. So interesting thing. After having human physiology when I was an undergraduate student, when I thought I wanted to go to med school, one of my buddies and I had the brilliant idea, which of course is wildly unethical, that we just run, which they exist now even at the time, just run a weight loss clinic, right? You come in and we'll just irradiate your thyroid and then give you prescriptions and regulate your thyroid hormone wherever we want it and just adjust your weight based upon all of those things. We're like, this is brilliant. We're going to be billionaires in the midst of all of this. We can't do that, right? Like it's wildly unethical to do those things. Unethical is the thing. Little did we know, right? How many of you guys might or might not be taking the GLP-1 sort of drugs and those things, whether you need them or not. People that are taking nicotine, all other sorts of things, they're gonna help regulate that. So anyway, but that is the thing. Commonplace for cancer too, really, really common. So I mean, it's very common to just remove the thyroids and then do hormone replacement and everything. Okay, I guess we're stopping. You all just collectively decided that we're stopping a minute early. So, seems like a reasonable place, that's fine. So we'll stop here, we'll pick this up on Wednesday, I'll get the next couple of things up for you guys. I entered grades, I entered stuff from last week, check it out and make sure if you didn't get what you think you should have, it's there, okay?